Hey boys and girls, I'm going to read to you a story from The Sea of Gold and Other Tales from Japan. Lots of words, not a lot of pictures. The Ogre Who Built a Bridge. Long years ago, there was a small village that stood beside a swift and rumbling river. The river was so fierce and strong, in fact, that no one had ever been able to bridge it. Although many, many men had tried, not one could build a bridge that was strong enough to withstand the roaring waters of the great river. If we only had a bridge so we could cross to the village on the other bank, the villagers sighed. Then we could trade with them, and all of us would grow prosperous. At last, one day, they had a plan. We will send for the best carpenter in all of Japan, they said. And they begged him to come, saying, "You are the only one in all this country who can build us the bridge we need." When the carpenter heard of their problem, he quickly agreed to come. "Of course I will help you, for I have built many bridges across many rivers, and I have no fear of your great river that will not be bridged." As soon as the carpenter arrived in the village, he went to inspect the great and troublesome river. He gasped in surprise when he saw it, for it was indeed a fearsome sight. He peered into its brown, murky waters, but it was so deep he could not see the bottom at all. And it was so wide that the opposite shore was only a faint, misty strip that seemed to float in the distant haze. The carpenter gazed silently at the rumbling water rushing over rocks and boulders, and it seemed to say, "Never ever will you build a bridge over me." The carpenter rubbed his forehead as a worrisome feeling swept over him. Of course, he had built the best bridges in all of Japan, but never before over a river such as this. He could not give up now, however, for he had made a promise to the villagers, and he must give them their bridge. As the carpenter looked at the churning water, he suddenly saw something enormous rise slowly to the surface from a mass of foaming bubbles. The giant head with two great horns gradually emerged from the river, spilling water as it rose like 1,000 great waterfalls. The carpenter was knocked off his feet by the shower of water that filled the air as the giant head shook itself. Then in a roaring voice it called out, "Oi, Mr. Carpenter, why do you sit there looking troubled?" The carpenter was so frightened, all he could do was quiver and shake. The great head that appeared out at him from the river was indeed the head of an enormous red ogre. On top of his head were two great horns, and his mouth was like a giant black cave that spread from ear to ear. The carpenter had never seen anything so frightening in all his life. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a tiny squeak. I, he stammered. "I know," the giant ogre shouted. "You want to build a bridge over this river, isn't that so?" The carpenter could only nod his head. "But it is quite impossible for you to build a bridge across this wide and terrible river, isn't that so?" Again, the carpenter, yes, that is so," he answered, still trembling. "So are you worried?" Yes, it is very true." "Well, in that case, you can stop worrying, for I will build a bridge for you. What is impossible for a puny human like you is nothing for a great ogre like me." The ogre bragged. "Why, I could have the bridge built before breakfast tomorrow morning." "Could you?" the carpenter asked. "Could you really?" "An ogre never lies," the ogre said indignantly. "Of course I could. I will have the bridge built by morning." The carpenter sighed happily to think that this problem was solved. "Well then," he said, "you must let me give you a gift in return for your help. Tell me, what could I give you?" Oh, the ogre was silent for a minute. A gift," he mused. "What useful thing could a puny human like you give a great ogre like me?" He thought and thought, turning his big horned head from side to side. Then a slow grin spread over his face. "I have it. You may give me one of your eyeballs." The carpenter gasped. "My eyeball," he objected, "but I only have two, and they are very precious to me." "But I am building you a bridge that no human could ever build," said the ogre coldly. "And besides, you've already promised me a gift." The carpenter stood silent, not knowing what to say. He wanted the bridge very badly, but he did not want to give up one of his precious eyeballs. The ogre grinned once more and then said, "Since you are so troubled, I will give you one chance to save your eyeball. I will build your bridge anyway, and if by tomorrow morning you can tell me what my name is, I will let you keep your eyeball. Is that a bargain?" The carpenter was sure he could somehow save himself by tomorrow. "I agree," he said in a small voice. When he heard that, the giant ogre disappeared as suddenly as he had come. With a loud gurgle and a churning roar, he vanished into the depths of the river, leaving only a few bubbles to show he'd been there at all. All that night, the carpenter could not sleep as he worried and wondered about the ogre in the bridge. He fretted and tossed, and whenever he closed his eyes, he saw the ogre grinning at him, holding out his hands for the gift. For the first faint of light morning streaked the sky, the carpenter hurried to the river to see if the bridge was truly built. He half hoped it was, and he half hoped it wasn't. As he reached the pebbled beach along the river, he looked up, and there stood the most magnificent bridge he'd ever seen. In the mist of early morning, it looked like a bridge to heaven. Its great curving arcs swept over the frothing waters, sturdy and strong, and yet it was as graceful as a willow tree. It was true. The ogre had built a bridge finer than any human could have built. As the carpenter stood admiring the bridge, the waters of the river began to churn and boil, and from the frothing bubbles there emerged once more the enormous head of the Red Ogre. "Well, Mr. Carpenter," he bellowed, "how do you like my bridge?" "It's magnificent," said the carpenter dismally. "Far better than any human could have built?" the ogre asked. The carpenter nodded. "Well then," the ogre went on, "you must keep your promise and give me an eyeball." "I have one more thing to ask of you," the carpenter said quickly. "Please just give me one more day to guess your name." The ogre tossed his great head and laughed until the ground under the carpenter seemed to crumble. "A puny human like you will never guess my name," he jeered. "But I will give you one more day, and that is absolutely all." Then once more he disappeared into the water with a final, swishing roar. The carpenter was so worried he didn't know what to do. "I must think of something. I must save my eyeball. I must discover his name," he mumbled to himself. He hunched over with worry and walked slowly toward the wooded hills behind the village. He had to think. He had to think very hard. He walked on, not realizing where he was going, and before long, he was deep in the forest, many miles from the little village by the river. The day was half gone, and still he had no idea at all what the ogre's name might be. "Ah, me, what shall I do?" he moaned. Then suddenly, he heard the high, faint sound of a strange chant-like song. He stopped to listen, for it wasn't the singing of birds or beasts. It was the sound of children's voices. What could these children be doing so deep in the woods, he wondered. Perhaps they could tell me how to get back to the village. The carpenter hurried toward the sound of the singing, but as he drew close, he saw that these were no ordinary children who danced and sang, for on each small head there were two little horns, and their mouths were stretched in wide grins from ear to ear. These were small ogre children playing in the secret shadows of the forest. The carpenter felt a shiver run down his back. He must creep away quickly before they saw him. But as he turned to go, he heard the song that they were singing. "Mr. Ogre, Mr. Ogre, Mr. Ogre, Raccoon, bring us the eyeball you got for the bridge. Hurry up and come to us, Mr. Ogre, Raccoon. Bring us the eyeball you got for the bridge." They were singing about his eyeball, and they were singing about the Red Ogre of the river. Now, at last, he knew the ogre's name. He was saved. His eyeball was saved. The carpenter scarcely dared to breathe as he backed slowly away so he would not be seen. He ran pell-mell down the hill, stumbling and gasping and rushing until he found his way back to the village. Early the next morning, the carpenter hurried to the bridge. And as soon as he arrived, the great red head appeared from the water. "Well, Mr. Carpenter," the ogre roared, "are you ready to give me my gift?" He rose slowly from the water and held out an enormous horned hand. But the carpenter shrank back. Just a minute. Let me guess, he said, for he did not want to give the answer too quickly and rouse the ogre's anger. The ogre let out a watery, gurgling chuckle. You'll never guess, puny carpenter, he said scornfully. The carpenter took a deep breath. Is it Ogre the Terrible River? Ha ha ha, it is not, roared the ogre. Is it Ogre with the horned head? Ha ha ha, it is not. Then is it Giant Red Ogre? You will never guess. Give me your eyeball and give it to me now. Then the carpenter shouted in his loudest voice. I know, it is Ogre Riku. That is your name. It's Ogre Riku, Ogre Riku. The great red ogre's mouth fell open in surprise as the grin disappeared from his face. How did you know? He shouted angrily. Then, without another word, the great red-headed ogre suddenly vanished into the river depths with a tremendous swoosh. The bubbles churned and boiled and frothed and foamed, and slowly they faded away until all that was left was one giant bubble on top of the water. Ogre Riku, the carpenter shouted once more for good measure. This time the single brown bubble popped, and even that was gone. Then there was nothing to see but the busy waters of the river, tumbling and rumbling and bumbling over the rocks and boulders. It was as though there had never been such a thing as the great red ogre at all. But when the carpenter looked up the river, the bridge still stood, forming a perfect arch over the rushing water. Ha! Red Ogre, thank you for the bridge! Then he hurried back to tell the villagers what had happened. At last you have a fine bridge to span the wild river, he cried happily. Never need you fear the terrible river again. And so it was. The bridge was sturdy and firm and withstood the torrents of the mighty river. It brought prosperity to the villages on both sides of the river, and it brought fame and riches to the carpenter. We shall name the bridge after you, the villagers said gratefully. But he shook his head. Call it the Bridge of the Red Ogre. And from that day on, that's exactly what the bridge was called. And just so you can look again, here's the bridge and the ogre and the ogre children. I hope you enjoyed this story from Japan, and I hope it reminds you of another fairy tale that you may have heard.